Well, last week we finished chapter 30, so tonight we're going to move on to chapter 31. So if you don't mind, turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 31. Let's read verses 1 and 2. But Jacob soon learned that Laban's sons were grumbling about him. Jacob has robbed our father of everything, they said. He has gained all of his wealth at our father's expense. And Jacob began to notice a change in Laban's attitude towards him. Now, the truth of the matter was that Laban's sons resented Jacob. And the reason they resented him is because he was successful. And what they were grumbling about was really ridiculous. If you remember when Jacob first agreed to go to work for Laban for 7 years in order to be able to marry Rachel, Laban didn't have very much. But in 14 short years, because of Jacob, Laban became a very wealthy man. Look back at Genesis chapter 30, verse number 30. It says, "You had little indeed before I came, but your wealth has increased enormously. The Lord has blessed you through everything I've done." And what's interesting is Laban doesn't deny it. Because before Jacob came, he had a few different flocks. He had a little bit. But once Jacob started working for him, he had that Midas touch. And in 14 short years, Laban was a very wealthy man. So Jacob was responsible for his wealth. Not Laban, not his sons. And that's why Laban practically begged Jacob to stay and to continue working for him. And to get him to stay, he promised Jacob that he could have all the goats that were born speckled, striped, and spotted, and all the sheep that were black from the flocks that he took care of. But as soon as Jacob agreed to stay, the very first thing that Laban did was he removed all of the goats that were striped, speckled, and spotted, and all of the sheep that were black, so they wouldn't breed with the other goats and sheep. And he placed them in his son's flock, and he told his sons to journey about 3 days away, because he wanted to make sure that those type of goats didn't breed with the flock that Jacob was supposed to be shepherding. Look at Genesis chapter 30, verse number 35. "But that very day Laban went out and removed the male goats that were streaked and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted or had white patches, and all the black sheep. He placed them in the care of his own sons." So Laban and his sons had every opportunity to increase their wealth, and at the same time they did everything that they could to stop Jacob from gaining any wealth. You know, it wasn't enough that they wanted to become more wealthy. They didn't want Jacob to become wealthy. And I think we see that quite often. Many times we read that and we think, well, why was Laban that way? But I'll be honest with you, I think the majority of people are that way. You know, we want to say that we're happy when someone gets a job and they start making more money than we make. But the truth of the matter is, we're not. We're a little bit jealous. We wonder why they got that job, why they're making that much money. And so this is kind of human nature. So they didn't just want to become wealthy, they also wanted to prevent Jacob from becoming wealthy. But here's the catch. Jacob was an expert at selective breeding. So he divided his flock into two groups. The best of the best he placed into one flock, and the rest were in the other flock. Now, the best of the best were hybrids. They were heterozygous rather than homozygous. Now let me explain what that means. The prefix hetero comes from the Greek word heteros. If you remember, the Greeks had two words for another, allos and heteros. Allos means another of the same kind. So I might come in and say, me and Terry, I'm a male and he's another male. I would use the Greek word allos, which means another of the same kind. But if I came along and I said, you know, I'm a human being and Lisa is another human being, I wouldn't use the word allos because it means another of the same kind. I would use the word heteros. Well, our prefix hetero comes from the Greek word heteros, and it means another of a different kind. The prefix homo that we use in English comes from the Greek word homo, which means the same. What's a homosexual? It's someone who's attracted to the same sex. Homogenized milk means that we take the cream out and it's all the same. We use that word homo to mean the same. Well, here when we talk about something being heterozygous, we mean that they're hybrids. In other words, they're the offspring from two different types of animals. So that's what a hybrid is. It's the offspring of two different types of animals, and in this case, two different types of goats. Now, these hybrids carried the recessive genes. So when Jacob bred two hybrid goats together, he was able to produce striped, speckled, and spotted goats. And when he bred two hybrid sheep together, he was able to produce black sheep. But not only that, because they were hybrids, they were stronger and better. Because you're able now to come in and breed from these different types, but you're trying to produce the best from each type. So when he took the best of the best and he began selective breeding, not only was he producing the type of goats that he got to keep, but he was also coming in and mixing them so his flock was bigger and stronger. So Jacob's flocks produced better animals. Now, Jacob didn't neglect the other flock under his care because he wasn't that type of person. Sometimes as we're going through the story, it makes it sound like, well, he only took care of his own flock and the rest, he just kind of let go. But that's not the case. He didn't do that at all. He still bred the other flock. He just didn't allow them to mix with his best flock. So the other flock increased also, but they were inferior. They were the same type of goats that Laban and his sons were breeding. So Jacob ended up with the best of the best, which meant that they were more valuable. So Jacob became very wealthy because his goats and his sheep brought top dollar. Now, Laban and his sons could have done the same thing, but they didn't because they didn't understand selective breeding. So what they were really upset about was the fact that Jacob was so successful, and they resented him big time because he was able to take his wages and multiply it exponentially. Remember, it took him 14 years to build Laban's wealth. But somewhere down the line, at the end of that 14 years, when he asked for his wages, he has a dream from God. And that's where he learns, as we're going to see in just a little bit, how to use this selective breeding to get what he needs. But what's interesting about it is before that time, he still was blessed and he was producing all of these animals for Laban. But when he found out through God, divine revelation, how to do this, he was able to take his wages and multiply it exponentially. So in 6 short years, Jacob had more wealth than Laban did. And that's why they were grumbling and accusing Jacob of gaining his wealth at his father's expense. And it wasn't just Laban's sons that resented Jacob. Laban resented Jacob also. So he started changing his wages, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But here's what I find interesting. As I was reading through this chapter yesterday, I started thinking about Jacob's experience in Haran. And I believe that Jacob's experience in Haran and his return to Canaan foreshadowed how his descendants would be treated, the Jews. In other words, there's an analogy between the way Jacob was treated in Haran and the way his descendants have been treated all over the world. So, if you don't mind, let me show you this analogy. Let me show you what I'm talking about. First of all, Jacob was forced to leave his homeland, but he always longed to go back to Canaan. And the same is true of most Jews. They were forced out of their homeland. We talk about the diaspora, and so we're talking about the Jews that have been scattered across the world, but they didn't go voluntarily. They were forced to leave their homeland, but they've always longed to go back to Israel, back to the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Secondly, Jacob prospered in Haran despite being oppressed and taken advantage of. People, that's true of the Jews. No matter where they've gone, they prospered, even in the worst of circumstances. Thirdly, Jacob's desire for gaining wealth kept him in Haran, even though he desired to go back to his homeland. Remember, he could have left, but Laban would have sent him away empty-handed. As a result, he stayed because there's a source here to gain wealth. So his desire for gaining wealth kept him in Haran, even though the desire to go back to his homeland was there. And you see that with many Jews. They want to go back to their homeland. They want to go back to Israel, but it means leaving their source of prosperity, and that's what keeps them from going back. Fourthly, Jacob's prosperity caused others to resent him. And of course, resentment always fosters animosity, and that's why you have antisemitism. Gentiles resent the way that Jews have prospered, not only in this generation, but from the time of Jacob. And that's why so many people accuse the Jews of becoming wealthy at their expense. If you ever listen to people who are anti-Semitic, it's always that, well, they're rich. And what they're insinuating is they're rich at our expense. But let me just tell you right up front, that's a bunch of crap, people. And if you're anti-Semitic, let me say this, you're anti-God. You are anti-Christian. The reason that there was a split is because around 80 AD, there was one rabbi, after Jerusalem was completely destroyed, that was able, under the Romans, to be able to leave. He was smuggled out through a coffin out of Jerusalem because they weren't allowing anyone to leave. And so he actually faked his own death. They didn't want to keep anyone that was dead inside the wall, so he was allowed to go out. He went to the Roman general, and he was allowed to take it. And Rabbinic Judaism started as a result of him. And then later on, he wanted to make sure that Jews would not follow, quote, the way. And as a result of that, there was actually, I'm trying to think of the word to use. I'm just going to use the word injunction, that if any person followed the way, then they would be excommunicated out of the synagogue. And as a result, you saw a huge split. You weren't even allowed to read any type of Christian literature. But here's what's interesting. The church kind of retaliated. And at the time of Constantine, they became very anti-Semitic. And so what we did was we kind of developed our own Christian traditions. And we almost forgot everything that had to do with Judaism. But we need to understand that Jesus was a Jew. And he's the Jewish Messiah. And when he comes back, we will celebrate the feast. We won't celebrate Good Friday. We won't celebrate Maundy Thursday. We won't celebrate those things. We will celebrate the Jewish feast. And so, for the majority of us, we don't understand the Bible because we look at it from a Western civilization mentality and not from a Jewish perspective. But the interesting thing about this is that we have become anti-Semitic. And usually it goes around this, well, they take advantage of other people. But people, that's not true. And last but not least, Jacob was persecuted by Laban and his sons. They did everything in their power to keep him down and to try to keep him from prospering. So eventually, what did Jacob have to do? He had to leave Haran. And that's happened to the Jews since the time of Jacob. They've been persecuted more than any other group of people. And it's a spiritual thing. The reason the world hates them is because they are God's chosen people. And as God's chosen people, they've been blessed. They've been prospered. But they wouldn't call it blessed because of the persecution. They feel like they've been cursed as a result of being God's chosen people. But as Christians, we need to make sure that we're not anti-Semitic. Because when we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, listen to me, we're grafted in. And these patriarchs that we're talking about, they're part of the root system. We are grafted in, and that's why the blessings of Abraham, listed in Deuteronomy 28, are ours. So we can't come in and separate Christianity from the Old Testament. It's the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Is everyone with me? Good. Now look at verse number 3. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your father and grandfather and to your relatives there, and I will be with you. Now, let me say something about Jacob here. Jacob was a very patient man and very tenacious, which means that he stuck with things even when things got tough. And he wasn't the type to make rash decisions or to act impulsively. So even though Laban had continually mistreated him, had deceived him, and he could feel his animosity and his son's animosity towards him, he was prepared to stick it out. Because that's the type of person that he was, and that's the type of people who succeed in this world. Look at the book of Proverbs, chapter 12, verse number 11. Notice what it says. A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies has no sense. Now let me read that again because that's very important. If you want to wonder why certain people prosper, most of the time it just has to do with their tenaciousness, their stick-to-itiveness. Notice what it says. A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies has no sense. Now, the truth is most people don't prosper because they don't ever stick with anything. Anytime things get tough, they don't like their boss, they don't like their job, they're not treating me right. What do? They pull up their roots and they leave. They go somewhere else and they chase after another fantasy. And what is that fantasy? That they're going to get rich and it's going to be very easy and they're going to live this life. Right? The dream. But the truth of the matter is if you want to prosper, you plant your roots and you stay in one place. You want to know why Cornerstone Fellowship is successful? One of the main reasons? Because I've been here for 25 years. And let me tell you, there were times when things got tough. It was like, you know what? We just ought to pull up roots and go somewhere else and plant a church. And you know what would have happened? We would have been that far behind. Each time we would have been starting over. If you want to succeed, you stay. So what I'm telling you is that if God hadn't told Jacob to leave and to return to Canaan, he probably wouldn't have. He would have just stuck it out and he would have made the best of it. But people, that speaks volumes about Jacob's character. I'll be honest with you, I get a little upset with pastors because they teach from the perspective that Jacob was this dirty, sneaky thief, and until God got a hold of him, he was a worthless person. People, that's not true. We went all the way back to when he was introduced, and it said that he was a plain man. And remember what that means in the Hebrew? It means that he was a just man. He was a righteous man. He was a person of the tent, which means that he didn't go around, but he learned the family business. And the time that he did deceive his father, it was at his mother's request. And what did he tell his mom? I don't want to do this. What if he discovers it's me? Then he will curse me. And what did she say? Son, just do what I tell you. I'll take care of it. But as we begin to look at the character of Jacob, he is not the man that most pastors, most preachers, most evangelists have portrayed him to be. This man was a godly man, a just man, a hard worker, and he was someone who didn't fly off the handle. He would bear up under pressure. And he showed it time and time again. Look at verses 4 through 9. So Jacob called Rachel and Leah out to the field where he was watching his flock. He said to them, I have noticed that your father's attitude toward me has changed. But the God of my father has been with me. You know how hard I have worked for your father, but he has cheated me, changing my wages 10 times. But God has not allowed him to do me any harm, for if he said, the speckled animals would be your wages, the whole flock began to produce speckled young. And when he changed his mind and said, the striped animals will be your wages, then the whole flock produced striped young. In this way, God has taken your father's animals and given them to me. Now, the whole reason that he called Rachel and Leah out to the field where he was watching his flock is because he knew that Laban and his sons were watching him, and he wanted to be able to talk to his wives privately, where no one would hear them. And he didn't want anyone eavesdropping because he knew that if Laban became suspicious about him leaving, that Laban would try to stop him. So he wanted to make sure that they talked in private and no one would think anything about his wives going out to see their husband as he's watching the flock. So when they came out to the fields, Jacob informed them about his plans for leaving, and then he explained why they needed to leave. And basically, there were 3 reasons. Number 1, because Laban resented Jacob for prospering. And he realized it's only going to get worse. Once resentment begins, it fosters animosity. And that animosity is only going to grow until eventually something bad is going to happen. There's going to be a blow up, there's going to be a fight, there's going to be things done or said that will forever change the course. The second reason is because Laban was cheating him. Now, Laban had always been a deceiver. He would always try to get one over on you. But now, he had gone far above that. Now he was just simply cheating Jacob. And last but not least, God told him to leave. Now, you need to understand something about Jacob. Jacob wasn't the type of person that made accusations that couldn't be proven. So he gave specific examples in verse number 8 of how Laban had been cheating him. Look at verse number 8. For if he said, who is he? Laban. For if Laban said, the speckled animals will be your wages, the whole flock began to produce speckled young. And when he changed his mind and said, the striped animals will be your wages, then the whole flock produced striped young. So in essence, what Laban had done is he had reneged on his word, and he began changing Jacob's wages. Now remember, originally, Jacob was supposed to get all of the goats that were born striped, speckled, or spotted. But when Jacob was able to produce almost all of the offspring of speckled and spotted goats through selective breeding, Laban changed the agreement. Oh, you're getting too much of the offspring. So he limited Jacob to only receiving one type. At the first, he began by saying, oh, well, that's too much here. You're only going to receive the speckled goats. So he changed his wages. And when Jacob was able to produce speckled goats because of selective breeding, he changed it to spotted goats or striped goats. But it didn't matter how he changed his wages because Jacob was able to produce that type of animal through selective breeding. And that's what so frustrated Laban. Because he would come in and go, okay, you're producing too many. No more is it going to be striped. Now you're going to get the spotted ones. And next season would come along and all of the offspring were spotted. Wow, you can't do that, so we're going to make them all speckled. And again, he was able to produce the type of goats that he wanted through this selective breeding. But here's what's interesting. Jacob never took credit for knowing how to do this. He gave the credit to God. Look at verses 9 through 12. In this way, God has taken your father's animals and given them to me. One time during the mating season, I had a dream, and I saw that the male goats mating with females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. And then in my dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob? And I replied, yes, here am I. The angel said, look up, and you will see that only the streaked, speckled, and spotted males are mating with the females of your flock. For I have seen how Laban has treated you. Now, if you remember, in the beginning, when they reached this agreement that this was going to be Jacob's wages, Jacob didn't have any striped, speckled, or spotted goats. They were either solid black or solid brown because Laban had culled the herd. He had removed all of the animals that were striped, spotted, or speckled from the flocks that Jacob was shepherding. So what God was telling Jacob through this dream is that they might not look striped, speckled, or spotted on the outside, but they carried the genes for it on the inside. But how did he know which ones carried those genes? Well, he knew which ones carried those genes because the biggest and the strongest males were driving the weaker males away. So God was telling Jacob that the biggest and the strongest goats are the ones that will produce the characteristics that you want. And after a while, by getting to know his animals and knowing what they produced when he bred with it, he was able to keep a record and a log, a journal, and he could produce what he wanted. And that's how Jacob knew to create a flock of hybrid goats and employ selective breeding to get what he wanted. It wasn't from himself, it was from God. Divine revelation. Now, notice what Jacob told Rachel and Leah. Look at verse number 9 again. In this way, God has taken your father's animals and he's given them to me. Now, Jacob wasn't saying that God literally took Laban's goats away from him and then gave them to him. No. People, that would be stealing. What Jacob was saying was that God showed him how to take Laban's goats and breed them to produce the type of goats he was supposed to get as his wages. And that's how he built his flock. He built it from Laban's animals. And not only that, the goats that he produced were the best goats. They were the most valuable goats. They were the ones that brought top dollar. But God was the one who gave Jacob the knowledge and the wisdom to do this. So Jacob gave God all of the credit. So when he's explaining to his wives how this happened, he said, do you think that I'm God and I'm miraculous? Do you think I could do this? No. I had a dream. And God showed me the big males who were driving the weaker ones away. They were striped, they were speckled, they were spotted. And they were mating with the females that were spotted and speckled and striped. And he said, it's God who did this. Now, if Laban and his sons hadn't been so resentful of Jacob, they could have learned how to do the very same thing. And they could have produced better goats themselves. Because remember, Jacob only received the striped, speckled, and spotted goats from the flock that he shepherded. Laban had a lot of flocks, and his sons were taking care of their own flocks. And if you remember, he went in and he culled out all of these from Jacob's, gave them and put them in his flocks, or his sons' flocks. They already had flocks, but he gave them more. And if they would have just asked Jacob, how are you doing this? I'm sure he would have shared it with them. So they could have done the very same thing. But their pride kept them from doing it. Plus, they resented him. How many of you know when you resent someone, you don't want to listen to them? You don't want to take any advice from them. You don't want to have anything to do with it. When they open their mouth, you just wish someone would slap them, right? This is how they became. Now, after Jacob explained to Rachel and Leah why they needed to leave, he allowed them to respond. You know, Jacob was a good husband. He really was. Again, we've kind of made him out to be someone who wasn't a good husband. But I just want you to notice the way he treats his wives. Now, he's going to make one big mistake. He's going to show favoritism. And that's going to be the mistake that he makes. And he's going to show favoritism based upon his favorite wife. That is a blemish on his character. We are going to see that, but that's what polygamy does. And he was not the one that first started that. It was forced upon him by his father-in-law when he deceived him and gave him Leah instead of Rachel. So we need to understand that. But let's look at verses 14 through 16 because Jacob gives his wives a chance to respond. He's laid out why they need to leave, but he wants input from them. So notice what they do. Rachel and Leah responded, that's fine with us. We won't inherit any of our father's wealth anyway. He has reduced our rights to those of foreign women. And after he sold us, he wasted the money you paid him for us. All the wealth God has given you from our father legally belongs to us and our children. So go ahead and do whatever God has told you to do. Now, how many of you know why women did not receive an inheritance in the Old Testament? Or at that time? Does anyone know why? The reason that women didn't receive an inheritance at that time is because that would create a transfer of wealth outside of the clan. Now, I'm going to give an example using Lisa and myself. And let's suppose that we lived way back then. And it was more of an agricultural nation, world. Most of the people made their living by either raising livestock or producing some type of crops. I married Lisa. Lisa came from the Meigs clan. I'm from the Nolan clan. Now, the Meigs clan wasn't blessed as much as the Nolan clan because the Meigs clan only had 2 males and 3 females. So Lisa had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, so there were 2 boys and 3 girls. The Nolan clan was blessed with 4 boys and only 1 girl. Now, here's what would have happened if girls received an inheritance at that time. If Lisa would receive an inheritance just as her brothers would, then she would receive land from her father, but because she's married into me, she's part of the Nolan clan, no longer part of the Meigs clan. Therefore, the wealth from the Meigs clan would be transferred to the Nolan clan. And Doug married Donnell, so the wealth from the Dean clan would be transferred to the Nolan clan. And Riddell married the Donatelli, so that from the Donatelli clan would be transferred. So one of the things that they did back then is women did not receive an inheritance. Because if you gave women inheritance, they went to live with their husbands, then they would take the property from the clan and it would go to the other clan. And that's why they didn't. How many of you knew that? And that's why when they came in and did the blessing, and you had the birthright, the oldest son got or received an extra portion. Because he was responsible for taking care of the women who maybe had been divorced or were still single, also the mother. So it was his job to take care of, so he received an extra portion. But that's the reason that women didn't receive an inheritance in that culture. Now, if we ever get to the book of Judges, and we're going kind of slow, I'll show you an exception to that, but there's some rules to that. Anyways, so women usually didn't receive an inheritance in that culture at that time. And that's why Rachel and Leah said, that's fine with us. We won't inherit any of our father's wealth anyway. It wasn't because Laban had turned his back on them. Not in this instance. It was simply because, as women, they weren't going to receive an inheritance anyway. But Rachel and Leah resented their father. And the reason they resented him is because their father had treated them like slaves. He sold them to Jacob without their approval. You see, even though marriages were arranged in those days, the future bride was still allowed to have input. But the implication in verse number 15 is that Laban didn't give Leah and Rachel a choice. When Jacob offered to work 7 years for Laban in exchange for the opportunity to marry Rachel, Laban accepted without consulting Rachel or Leah. And when 7 years passed and Laban had Leah deceive Jacob, she didn't have a choice. She was forced to do it. So they felt like Laban treated them more like a slave rather than daughters. He sold them as if they were foreigners. And he didn't give them any choice in the matter. And that created resentment between his daughters and him. So when they're talking to him, they said, well, we're not going to receive an inheritance anyway. We're women. But also, he's not treated us like daughters. He's treated us like slaves. He sold us to you. We had no input into this. Now, look at the last part of verse 15. He has reduced our rights to those of foreign women. And after he sold us, he wasted the money you paid him for us. Now, what does it mean he wasted the money? Did they have a right to that money? Well, let's see what they're talking about. I want you to underline the word wasted there. Wasted is translated from the Hebrew word akal, but it doesn't mean to waste, at least not in this context. It means to consume for yourself and not to share. Let me say that again. It means to consume for yourself and not to share. So what they were saying, what Rachel and Leah were saying, was that after Jacob fulfilled his obligation to Laban as an indentured servant, their father was going to send them away empty-handed. He wasn't going to share any of the wealth that he had received over the last 14 years. And the reason it irritated them is because the whole reason their father was wealthy was because of their husband. He had worked for 14 years, and Laban had very little when he came. He didn't have the ability to be able to multiply it, but when their husband came, he was worked for him for 14 years, and he multiplied his wealth exponentially. And then, after he's fulfilled his required service as an indentured servant, the father was going to send them away empty-handed. And they were his daughters. And their children were his grandchildren. But that didn't matter to Laban. He still intended to send them away empty-handed if Jacob didn't agree to work for him. He wasn't willing to share any of what Jacob had done for him, which was totally against the custom of that day. Now remember, Laban used the customs and the traditions of the day when it suited him. When it didn't suit him, he didn't buy into it. But you see, it was the custom and the tradition of that day, and we know that because of the Newsy tablets. They tell us that. But then we go a little bit further. By the time Moses comes along, we see the Mosaic law. They were supposed to share after the indentured servant actually fulfilled his obligation. You were supposed to bless him. Turn with me, if you would, to Deuteronomy 15, verses 13 through 14. When you release an indentured servant, do not send him away empty-handed. Give him a generous farewell gift from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. Not from one of the three, but from all three. Share with him some of the bounty, now notice, with which the Lord your God has blessed you. In other words, he's helped you to create this wealth. And God blessed you So you be a blessing and you share what he helped to produce. And why Rachel and Leah were upset is because after he fulfilled his service in 14 years and wanted to go home, the reason he wanted to go home is because he just knew it was the custom of the time that his father-in-law would come in and say, you know, you've made me a very wealthy man. Let me bless you. I'll give you some of the livestock. I'll give you some of the agriculture. I'll give you some from the wine press. I'll send you away blessed. But he didn't do it. It was basically, if you don't come work for me, then I'm going to send you away empty-handed. And the daughters were crushed. Because you're not just sending him away, Daddy. You're sending us away, and we've got little children. And they range, if you remember, when he was going to go away, he'd worked 14 years, but he didn't get married till 7 years. In the process of 7 years, they had these little kids, 10 to 11 of them, that were only up to 6 years old, and he's going to send them out empty-handed. Now, how would you feel if you were Rachel and Leah, and your father was Laban, and he treated you that way? Well, that's why they didn't feel bad when Jacob became more wealthy than their father. In their mind, both Jacob and Laban had received what they deserved. Look at verse 16 again. All the wealth God has given you from our father legally belongs to us and our children. So you go ahead and do whatever God has told you. In other words, all that we have is ours legally. You earned it, Jacob, fair and square. So it doesn't matter if he's resentful. We're with you. You told him what you would work for. He agreed to it. He's cheated you. He has changed your wages time and time again. But even in the midst of that, you've still done right by him. You've still increased his flocks. But you also were very wise, and you've made us wealthy. And you each have received what you deserved. So, Jacob, we'll follow you. You do what you need to do. Now, this is where we're going to stop tonight, and we'll start in verse number 17 next week. But here's what's interesting. I'm going to give you a little tidbit. Rachel is a little bit like her daddy. And she's going to create problems. But the reason she does is because she's a little bit like Laban. And I'll bring that up next week.